I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker, Giuseppe, who conducts research on socio-ecological change in modern societies. He's based at the Copernicus Institute for Sustainable Development. I've been personally quite a bit inspired by his work as well on critical perspectives on sustainability transitions and socio-technical transitions. I think his contributions have been key in kind of intervening in this space and thinking more broadly and critically. But he also indeed focuses a lot on agri-food systems, grassroots actors such as civil society and social movements. He's also researcher activists as part of Anders Utrecht, and I'm sure a few other initiatives. So yes, please give a warm welcome to Giuseppe.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I can't share my screen at the moment. It's disabled, the option. So perhaps if the organizers can enable that,
Of course, we'll fix that in a moment.
Yeah, thanks. Meanwhile, I'll just thank the organizers for inviting me. Oh, there it is. And and for the introduction. I mean, I'm very happy to be here. Let me see. Do you see the slides?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Okay. It's an incredible program you've put together, so it's very nice to be part of it and bring a little contribution, which will be essentially from a project I'm working on, where we look at grassroots initiatives in the agri-food system and if and how they deconstruct capitalism in their attempt to transform towards sustainability. We use the term unmaking, and I will get there in a second. I'll give you just a little bit of background very quickly, because I think this audience doesn't need probably a lot of background. I'll just cover a few basics, and then I'll go into talking a little bit more about grassroots initiatives and the research gap that we tackle, and then this theoretical proposal. How do we think about this deconstruction of capitalism in grassroots initiatives? And I will then present a couple of cases, so some empirical material from a case in Colombia and a case in the Netherlands before concluding. Part of what I'm presenting is published, and I'll give some references at the end of the talk, and part of it is in progress, or publications have been submitted, but they're not out there. But, all right, so just for a bit of context, I guess, again, to this audience, it won't be a surprise that I noticed the fact that we're facing multiple crises, ecological and socio-ecological crisis, climate, of course, top of the agenda in many ways, but many others that are interconnected and perhaps have been get less attention. These challenges and crises are anthropogenic. Probably many of you have seen this type of graphs, the great acceleration, as it's called by some scholars. It can be traced back to the sort of the post-Second World War period, or according to some more critical scholars, much further back. But the point is that the sort of the challenges are driven really by our way of life, our way of using, consuming, living together, etc. And the effect of this acceleration, right, is that we're surpassing what other scholars call the planetary boundaries, sort of the biophysical limits within which our societies have existed so far, and we are, in a sense, breaking some of those boundaries and moving into a space where much more uncertainty. We will probably experience much more uncertainty and more extreme situation, right, climate-wise. So a space that is unsafe, or anyway, much more uncertain than the more stable conditions that have combined our experience as society so far. And this is just to stress that the scale and the magnitude of the challenges is really huge. And there's a certain agreement, I would say, that really tickling at the margins of our way of doing, being, and producing and consuming is not sufficient. To respond to this existential threat, we essentially need some sort of fundamental societal transformation, okay, which would be anticipatory to hopefully minimize those more traumatic effects, or forced by the effects of these ecological challenges. And this fundamental transformation really is not only about infrastructure, but it's really about deeply sort of rooted patterns of life, of thinking, and the allocation of benefits, burdens, rights within society. Now, this is a quote by two science and technology studies scholars, and it refers to energy transition, but it can well be extended to well, society as a whole, or any other sector we think of, including agri-food systems. And indeed, sort of the idea of a transformation or transition towards sustainability has become a sort of policy mantra from the United Nations to the European Environment Agency, the European Union, and many other, many governments worldwide, etc., and many civil society initiatives and grassroots initiatives use this idea and this imaginary to think about change towards sustainability. So to stress the need for this fundamental change, of course, they understand it all in sorts of in many different ways, right? One way of thinking about that transformation, with that, which I think is crucial and it's part of that debate, is the fact that the transformation entails necessarily a move beyond capitalism, or a reform of capitalism into something else that we might not actually recognize anymore as capitalism. Okay, these are just a couple of quotes from two scholars who point to the need really to shift big cultural frames, right? The importance of economic growth, the dominance of fossil fuel capitalism, and this hope of modernity as unending progress, right? That underpins that great acceleration that I mentioned earlier. So essentially, there's some sort of, I wouldn't say it's a widespread agreement, but there's a strong voice that stresses that essentially to achieve any meaningful sustainability targets, and definitely to achieve the transformation that might save us from the most sort of threatening effects of socio-ecological challenges, we really need to tackle and to transform essentially the global capitalist system. And this is just another quote from scholars in that sort of line of thinking. So hopefully I've convinced you. For the sake of time, I could speak for a long time about that, but I hope sort of you see where I start, so that my starting point, and hopefully it resonates a bit with thinking, but happy to discuss this later in the Q&A. And much of my research and my interest has been so far to look at how grassroots initiatives contribute, and in some cases lead, this type of fundamental societal transformation, which I've mentioned and which I've claimed is needed. I'm referring here to energy communities, eco-villages, repair cafes, community-supported agricultures. So type of grassroots civil society initiatives that develop alternative ways of thinking about progress, thinking about living together and being together, interacting with nature and among human beings. And they actually realize in all sorts of very inspiring and also imperfect in many ways, the institutions and the practices and the technologies that enable these other ways, alternative ways of thinking, of being, and doing, and put them into practice. There's a whole range of experiences. I also have figures which I want to show you. We're talking of hundreds and thousands of initiatives for each of these different types across Europe and across the whole world. So it's a big phenomenon, and it's also very diverse, diverse in practice, and also referred to in the literature in many different ways, from community economies, alternative to capitalism, grassroots initiatives, social innovation, and so forth. These are some of the terms that you might have heard. Some common characteristics is that these initiatives are based in the civil society, so they don't aspire to political office or winning political office or economic benefits. Okay, they have this ambition to contribute to sustainability, which is defined differently in different, in their different contexts. They are based on community. They're very rooted in place, but they are also connected into networks of translocal networks and even networks of networks. So you have transition towns. There's a transition town network. There's eco-villages, and eco-villages are networked. Same for community-supported agriculture and so forth. And as I said, they're very diverse in size, history. They focus sometimes on very specific issues: agri-food, energy, care, or some other times they have perhaps a more holistic perspective, and so forth, right? Political orientation, etc. What is common in all of them is that they really produce change. They create spaces of change where new relations, new institutions, new practices are not only called for and envisioned, but they are actually realized. And again, often in very imperfect ways and with all sorts of compromises, but also in ways that are very promising, inspiring, and also successful in many ways. So you see here a table where I contrast sort of lists of, in a sense, principles, and again, that are then put into practice. So we might think of mainstream, sort of our mainstream capitalist system as aiming at increasing wealth, being based on logics of accumulation, limitless growth, efficiency, etc. And often we see in these grassroots initiatives a movement towards an emphasis not on wealth, but on well-being, not on accumulation, but on commoning, not on efficiency, but on sufficiency, and an emphasis that is on the collective rather than on individual, etc. Okay, so we see this type of change. Now, accepted that we do see that change, it still remains essentially a gap to understand how this transformation actually occurs. Okay, so we have, of course, many case studies that focus on specific aspects, but what are the mechanisms? What are the social dynamics and mechanisms that enable that type of transformation? And just have one quote here from Jürgen Kallis, referring, known scholar, of course, in the growth and political ecology field. It asks a similar question here, right? How do collectives and movements undo growth in practice? Yeah, and how do they unsettle the imaginary? And I would say even more broadly, not only the aspect of growth, but all the other, related logics of capitalism. How are they changed and transformed? The first partial answer is that lies exactly in that aspect of prefiguration. Okay, so what all these initiatives have in common is that they primarily create alternatives here and now. So they don't only envision, and think about sustainable futures to be realized at some point, but they actually, with all the difficulties and the challenges, they realize those sort of alternatives here and now. And so this can be seen in two levels. So they create alternative systems of provision and alternative social relations. So for example, they produce energy on the base of community energies and cooperatives, or they produce food in community supported agriculture, or they repair, tools and technologies, right? And this is alternative system of provision, which is also organized according to different social relations, right? So different way of organizing work, for example, different way of valuing objects and valuing labor. There also prefigure more egalitarian organizational forms. So what you also observe in most of these initiatives is that they're also organized in ways that are very horizontal, non-hierarchical, inclusive, respectful of diversity, etc. And this is also another way of prefiguring the type of future that these movements and this grassroots initiative would like to see realized also in the future. Now, the theory of prefiguration tells us that key to this ability to prefigure alternatives is a strong sense of hope, which contrasts to the despair that perhaps the type of graphs that I showed you at the beginning might cause, right? So there's a strong sense of hope. There's a strong creativity and experimentation. So this process of prefiguration and creation of alternative is not a linear process, not at all. It comes about through experimentation of many different possible solutions, technologies, ways of organizing, right? And then, so it's a very open process where there's often, movement forward and then backwards and then forward again. And there's action going in different direction, but then, and through a process of emergence, then some configurations of technologies, social organizations, institutions, values emerge and sort of consolidate. So they also institutionalize. Yeah? They become institutionalized ways of organizing these initiatives, of producing food, of producing energy, and of giving care, providing care, etc. But this institutionalization, we also know in prefigurative initiatives, is always flexible, right? There's always this process of self-reflexivity and self-criticism that enables also the adaptation of these institutions to changing conditions and to, again, further experimentation. And there's a strong future orientation in this, right? So there's this idea that of realizing now what we hope might be really, in a sense, the mainstream in the future. However, so okay, that's how you might visualize it in a very sophisticated, graphical way. So we have the grassroots initiatives. There's an aspiration to realize, to realize a certain future, a certain alternative future, and that there's the process of emergence, creativity, right, experimentation that characterizes prefiguration, and that aspiration, in fact, it's an horizon. It's an horizon. So it's hardly ever reached per se. It's really more a target, that motivates and sort of inspires and guides action in the present. I said earlier, this is only a partial answer, I think. There are some gaps in this way of thinking, and these are the 2 bullet points which I'll address now. So the first one is the so-called innovation bias. And so it's this idea that we tend to think of change and transformation towards sustainability as well as coming from the introduction of new values, technologies, institutions, practices, right? Which we assume to in some way or another, to automatically displace the old one, the old and unsustainable ones, right? And this is a common sort of bias in thinking, both in sort of those who propose techno-modernist sort of solution, but also in many activists and also active in the grassroots innovation. So there's the emphasis is much more on the creation of novelty, than on what needs to get to go. Okay, And of course, there are reasons, as you see in this quote by Deborah Davidson, there are reasons why it makes sense to stress a lot the novelty. However, in this project and in my thinking, I was inspired by a number of scholars who have pointed also to other ways and other, so to the other side, in a sense, of this process. So what we might call subtraction, and what I will also refer to in other terms later. So on the one hand, again, there we can think of transformation through the addition, of innovation, which might be social innovation, technical, cultural, or this process of prefiguration. Okay, but there are also other aspects. There's the other side, which is that of decolonization, of disruption, of exit, or exodus, to create autonomous spaces for diverse economies. And it's not just a metaphorical aspect. There are really different mechanisms that we might see in playing a role here. So if you think of transforming by adding innovation or solutions, you point to mechanisms of competition, right? So the idea that the novel solution, technology, practice will outcompete the old one. And you also refer to concepts like the winds of opportunity. So you hope to see, or you will hope to create conditions for some sort of scaling up. Those moments of opportunity where niches of innovation, niches of novel practices might scale up, right, and become more accepted in a more widespread way. If you think of subtraction, well, there are different ways, different mechanisms, right? So we think more of the possibility of making space, so getting rid of what is blocking, in a sense, right, the creation of alternatives, or even breaking out altogether from established structures in order to sort of have, again, that space to create alternatives almost in a parallel system. There's a second gap, which is related to the relation between prefiguration and deconstruction or subtraction. So some scholars, of course, also in the prefiguration, sort of scholars who have worked on prefiguration or social innovation, etc. So in this field, have pointed also somehow to this other side of the story. Okay, so Stein talks of hope, right, as motivating and fueling prefiguration, but also discussed the counter side of negativity. Flora Avellino talked of different types of power, so the power to create alternatives, but also the power to the countervailing power, to counter existing system. Pellizzoni talked of prefiguration and subtraction, so I'm using the term here also from him. So in a sense, we can see already, we can see in the literature also this other side of the fact that that grassroots initiatives don't only aspire, and to be something else, so that they aspire to an alternative, but they also refuse to reproduce existing structures, ways of thinking, etc. However, the characterization of deconstruction remains, in my view, quite vague. So it's not really clear what are the social and social cognitive processes that define or that characterize deconstruction. And often this deconstruction or subtraction, right, is seen as a stoppage. And I think, as I will argue, that actually the sort of the deconstruction, that subtraction, has a generative function in of itself. And then this articulation of construction and deconstruction remains also underdeveloped. One thing, how do these two processes relate to each other? How are they entangled? One idea that seems to answer at least some of these gaps is that of seismogenesis, which was used by David Graeber and David Bengrove. They borrowed it actually from Gregory Bateson. And so they refer to this process of seismogenesis. So it's a two words, like there's a schism, so the separation, and the genesis, right, of genesis of new social forms, as a process of conscious self-determination by differentiation. And they they use this idea to discuss ancient societies, and in particular to discuss the existence of egalitarian societies in the past, and to counter some widely some assumption about the way human civilization evolved. But for us, the important point really here is that cultural groups can deliberately, essentially, they define themselves also by deliberately rejecting and explicitly rejecting other cultural forms. And this rejection is a fundamental part, so it's what informs then the institutionalization of alternative social forms within the group. Okay, so there's an explicit rejection of an external group, of another group, and that informs the institutionalization of social forms within the group. So grassroots initiatives interact with that system. They exist in the system, right? They are in, they are always sort of niches that exist within a system that thinks according to different logics. So they are in a constant interaction with that system, but they refuse to reproduce certain structures, certain ways of thinking, certain institutional forms, ways of organizing, etc. And this is, in a sense, an interesting idea because it's it helps us connect a little bit more, or brings in a little bit more this generative idea of refusal. So refusal is not just the stoppage of something that is undesired, but there's a direct connection to the genesis, of social forms within a group. It brings in also cultural confrontation as a force of schismogenesis, okay, which is also an interesting the aspect of conflict. But refusal remains still too vague. There's still, this explicit rejection, this conscious refusal of other cultural forms. What does it entail, really? And how does it look like? And what type of processes, really, cognitive processes and social processes characterize that? And here we come to sort of our contribution from the project, where we introduce this a way of thinking about exactly this aspect of what deconstruction of what Graeber and Wenger talk about as refusal. So in a paper a couple of years ago, I suggested this idea of thinking about the unmaking of capital. So the diverse processes that are activated deliberately by grassroots initiatives or radical alternatives that are incompatible with capitalist configuration. These processes are activated exactly with the idea of the aim to make space for alternatives. Okay, so there's the idea that it's not that of competition, right? The mechanism that I mentioned earlier. So it's not like you add an alternative and that will displace the old unsustainable practice or technology or values. But really, it is a process of deliberately making space for the alternative, so to enable the emergence and consolidation of alternatives. Some concrete examples, perhaps just to make things a little bit more concrete. For example, in the transition town movements, members of the movement go through so-called inner transition, which is a guided process of liberation of the self, which it's a liberation from some addictive and exploitative ways of interacting with humans and non-humans, which enables then the reconnection according to other logics and in other forms with humans and non-humans. A myriad of urban agricultural collectives all over the world physically deconstruct public spaces that were built with a different purpose, and that's what enables them to convert those spaces into spaces that are suitable for agricultural production. Lamasiko village in Wales, at some point in its history, lobbied for the abolition of a particular piece of legislation, which would have made self-built eco-housing illegal. All right, so they abolished that, and that enabled the possibility, or made it possible for them to build eco-housing, and so forth. Okay, so you can see the type of logic and very different types of processes. So what is common to all of these examples is really the fact that the disarticulation, the unmaking of the unsustainable capitalist configuration is not a consequence, but a precondition for the construction of sustainable post-capitalist one. And it's not an either or, okay? So it's not like, oh, it's all about deconstruction or it's all about construction, but it's more, is sort of what I propose is really a rejection of this idea that there's an automatic displacement of the unsustainable configuration by the novel sustainable configuration. And rather, I propose to look at construction and deconstruction, so the making of the alternatives and the unmaking of capitalism as an entanglement, okay? We use different theories and concepts to look at this from different fields. And this is a bit also the challenge intellectually and theoretically to bring different theories together and use them side by side. But it's not this part that I want to go in depth, so not on the theories. I'd really like to talk you through a couple of cases, which I think will illustrate our way of approaching transformation to sustainability in two agri-food initiatives, and also illustrate sort of the use of this or the value, in the sense of thinking about transformation as a process of unmaking and making, okay? So the first case that I want to present is the one of Territorio Campesino Agroalimentario in Colombia. So we asked these questions in a sense, in which sense is TCA, Territorio Campesino Agroalimentario? What does it unmake capitalism, if at all? How does it do it? And what are the processes of unmaking, yeah, that we can observe and making of post-capitalist realities? So what is TCA? TCA is at the same time, it's a collective vision of an alternative future. It's a political tool for the institutionalization of a peasant society, and it's also a physical geographical area. It's actually several areas because there are several territories which have been constructed or are in the process of being constructed. I will focus on the empirical material we have and we have used for this paper is from the first territory that was created across the regions of Norte de Nariño and Sur de Cauca. And you can see sort of a map. I mean, what is interesting here is the areas marked in red, which are mining concessions, and I'll get back to that in a second. So is it a transformation, first of all? Well, I would say yes. In which way? It's a transformation in the sense of transformation of, in terms of the construction of a peasant territoriality, which means the socio-ecological re-embedding of the economy, opposition to capitalism and development with capital D, right? The capitalist development. And it's the construction of an economia propia. I left this in Spanish because I always find it difficult to find the term that really encompasses three ideas, which are in that term propia, which are the idea of appropriateness, ownership, sovereignty, and endogeneity. So it's an economy that has these three characteristics. And you see a couple of quotes. One is in Spanish, because I want also to show how peasants themselves talk of this construction of TCA as a transformation, okay? So it's not, it's also in their own vocabulary. Of course, we are doing an analysis here using different concepts, but it's the idea that this is a transformation is also quite clearly part of their own narrative. And I will show you now a couple of slides where we have in white shaded text boxes the peasant institutions, with in brackets the processes of making, and then the gray shaded text boxes are processes of unmaking. So we start with the economia propia, as I said, yeah. So this set of situated economic relations that function on the principle of sufficiency, mentioned earlier as well. Justice, food sovereignty, the protection of the environment and human relation. Yeah, this is from one of the documents of TCA. Economia propia is based on, well, it comes with a number of newly created institutions, peasant institutions. So there's the autonomous governance institution, so-called gobierno campesino, or the peasant government, which is meant not to replace, but to exist in parallel with the state authorities. And this is sort of is the organ that guides this transformation and manages the territory into the future. And the representatives are sort of elected in municipal meetings to ensure representation from all the regions of this territory. And each region elects ideally a woman, a man, and a member of the youth. Okay, so to guarantee diversity. There's the Plan de Vida Digna, so community planning, and this is a form of essentially community-led planning. It aims at conducting the processes of construction of the vision of possible futures and empowering the community to inhabit, govern, decide, and legislate over the territory. And the principles that inform this community planning are those of solidarity, justice, dignity, and an holistic view of human life, autonomy, sovereignty. Okay, so you see that essentially the basis, yeah. And then there's the Guardia Campesina, the institutions of knowledge commons, which is so the peasant participate in distributed knowledge production and circulation. So peasant to peasant models of exchange, which is central also to the to this network, this network of communities in the territory. So one of the ways of connecting and exchanging. And then there's the Guardia Campesina, which is sort of a peasant guard, but it's an unarmed group of people who are elected, again, in the number of 3 per municipality. They undergo a certain training, but their role is not that of fighting or entering into violent exchanges with any other actors, but it's that of observing the territory and establishing a communication system to spread alerts in case of a threat. For example, the intrusion of a mining company. And to therefore lead then mobilization against that threat. So these are in some sort of the institutions that are being created, but the creation of those institutions is made possible only by the unmaking of social and ecologically destructive presence of capitalism, as embodied in particular in the extractive industries and the agribusiness. So the vision and the practice of this autonomous society, peasant society, is based on agroecological agriculture, which would be essentially incompatible, would be critically undermined by the ecological destruction in terms of soil contamination, disruption of water cycle, biodiversity loss caused by the extraction of natural resources. And agroecology also depends on a lot of labor and knowledge, and it wouldn't be compatible with sort of the disruption that also agribusiness and mining company bring to the communities, with the extraction of labor, the extraction of people, and the sickening of people who are then unable to work. So the peasants in TCA and Nariño have achieved the, sort of this unmaking of ecological and social destruction in 2 ways. So first, they've deliberately, although sometimes partially, withdrawn from the market economy. So from this food supply chains, for example, and the exploitative labor markets that attach to that, in an effort to localize the economy. So to embed, again, social relations and the ecological flows locally. And secondly, they have engaged in the expulsion of destructive enterprises from the territory. And one case, which is very important, was the expulsion of the company Gran Colombia Gold, mining company, which was expelled after social mobilization a few years back. And this was in itself made possible by the creation of another institution, which is the border. Of course, the border you cannot see physically, but it's in the mind of people, right? And it's this border, the creation of the border, which was also defined based on participated deliberation. The border is maintained by the Guardia Campesina, that sort of monitors it, but also it's reproduced symbolically through material actions such as marches and events, which are attended by hundreds of people yeah? And that these marches take place, right, along the border, sort of reproduce the existence of this border. And then the construction of the new institutions also rests on process of deliberate refusal and unlearning of development imaginaries and imperatives and the related subjectivities of peasants and human beings. So here there's this conscious effort of peasants to refuse the development paradigm. They're really they have a whole critique, they've developed a whole critique of development from their perspective of endless economic growth, material accumulation, etc. And of the identity of peasant, which historically in Colombia have been marginalized and sort of seen as a sort of a legacy of the past that needs to go, right, to make space for modernity and development. So here there's a conscious effort to not use a certain grammar, certain vocabulary, to talk about themselves, to talk about nature. And this enables the creation of a new way of talking, right? New vocabulary. So for example, farmers wouldn't talk of, would refuse, consciously avoid talking of nature as natural resources, but they would talk of vital goods or ancestral heritage. They would narrate a different story of the peasantry, one that is more empowering, that shows the agency the peasantry has had in the past. And again, this is a conscious effort to refuse a certain memory, of peasantry and of the past, that enables the creation of a different one. I will move on here because I want to talk also about the other case. And so and there's with that idea of development comes also a certain economy-centered identity. And again, there's a deliberate refusal of saying, oh, we are not consumers, and we're not only consumers, and also we are not only agricultural entrepreneurs. Okay, we are human beings, which is, I don't know, of course it's obvious in many ways, but essentially there is that refusal of, in the words of the peasant, quote, what the system wants us to want. Okay, so there's really they're trying to again reject that identity and build on a more holistic identity that is enables then that more holistic, rooted way of living. This is just a table to summarize some of the processes at which I've talked. So the process of unmaking, talk of refusal, unlearning of discourse, the withdrawal, the expulsion. So of course, DCA doesn't unmake capitalism as a global system, but it does unmake capitalism as a set of situated relations, institutions, practices, cultural models that exist in that particular space. Briefly, I wanted to talk about another case, which is in a sense very different, but where we observe also process of unlearning. And this is a case of two CSAs, community supported agriculture farms in the Netherlands. This is work which is led by one of PhD student working with me, Laura van Oors. She's done huge amount of work on this, and I'll do my best also to present some of the key ideas here. So CSAs, they're a partnership between farmers and consumers who become both members. So it's not producers and consumers anymore, but they become member of essentially a community around a farm or a number of farms. And they commit to each other essentially to sharing the risks and sharing the produce. Now, many CSAs work on the basis of a fixed monetary contribution by the members. But these two farms have moved recently to what is called solidarity payment scheme. Okay, so the amount the members contribute to compensate for the work and the produce that they get from the farm is essentially voluntary. There's no upper or lower limit. Okay, so each member, each household that is part of this CSA can decide voluntarily how much to contribute. And the idea is that their contribution is based on solidarity. It's solidarity in the sense that it's solidarity with the farmer, as also in general with CSAs, but the idea that as we will see, it values more the work of the farmer than a normal payment scheme, but it's also sort of the contribution and the solidarity with other members, because there are other members who struggle, or other families or households that struggle to pay a fixed quote. They might want to pay less, but others could pay more, right, and balance that. So it's also a way to make CSAs more inclusive, essentially, to lower income households. So the idea is to strike the balance between a fair income for farmers and the inclusion of less affluent members. And so this is the solidarity, and that's why it's, in a sense, this is solidarity payment scheme is particularly, in a sense, promising, right, and interesting. But it creates a problematic situation, okay, because there's a routine. Members are used to pay a certain amount. They take it for granted. They don't question how that amount was decided, right? And suddenly there's a farmer, at least in these two cases, the solidarity payment scheme, the idea of a solidarity payment scheme came from the farmers. So there's a farmer asking you, what do you want to pay? And suddenly this creates a problematic situation where farmers themselves and members have to rethink the situation. And to conceptualize this, we use unlearning, which is one of the theories, as I said earlier, which we are working with. And there are two strands of sort of thinking around unlearning. There's organizational change management and innovation management. Here, it's more unlearning of routines and knowledge that are sort of not fit, essentially, in an organization, or make an organization unfit in its environment. Okay, so the market changes, or the context, political context changes. The company or the organization internally needs to discard old and obsolete knowledge in order to make space for new knowledge, or discard old routines that are not working anymore and create new ones. There's another strand of thinking which comes from decolonial studies and feminist studies. And here it has been used, the concept of unlearning has been used more in terms of the pedagogy and the transformative sort of processes, where unlearning refers much more about sort of accepting or in a sense also processing and then liberating oneself from certain prejudices, right, and ways of thinking and biased thinking patterns. So we try to see whether we observe either type of process. So the trigger for the introduction of SPS, or solidarity payment schemes, was really the fact that the farmers realized that they weren't happy. Essentially, they were in the CSA, which in theory is it's already a more sustainable way of interacting with nature, with the community, and producing food, etc. But in reality, they were underpaid, overworking, etc. And they started to think about themselves not only as part of this community, but of course as part of the agri-food system more broadly. And so, in these two different farms, right? The processes went on separately. They were not connected, so individually within each of the two farms. Farmers started to confront members with the reality. Okay, what is the gross hourly wage that you would like to pay us? Okay, and they did it in different ways. In one farm, they organized meetings and workshops around where they actually discussed the budget of the farm with the members, something that's normally not done, so the members could see the figures. In another farm, they sent letters, and then there were some forms that were sent and were filled by the members. So different ways of doing it. But the farmers themselves started to question, essentially, and to unlearn certain farm structures. So they already themselves started to question some assumptions about how the farming system works, but also how the CSA itself as an alternative actually works. And so they started to reject those habitual practices, and the formal rules on how to attribute value and what to value, right? Do you value the labor of the farmer? Do you value the produce that is then distributed? And there was a lot of internal struggles, discomfort, and the sense of guilt. They felt, oh, they're asking more money to the members, right? And this was they felt this might not be accepted by the members. So it was a very deeply felt process of unlearning. And many members picked this up and actually showed signs of unlearning themselves. So they this uncomfortable situation, this being confronted by the farmers with the issue of, you know, they're being exploited and underpaid, made them think. So they actually, you see some of the quotes here, but you know, they started rethinking, okay, what do we need to value? What are we actually, you know, what are we paying for when we contribute to the CSA? So there's plenty of quotes that show that this realization, right? And this switch. So it's the what, so the value and what are they paying for, but then it's the how, right? So the more rational process of thinking and realizing and switching, but there's also a very important emotional component. So there's this conflict, internal conflict, or feeling really challenged by the farmers. But there were also members that did not unlearn. They say, okay, well, I don't want to know anything about paying. Okay, so the farmer should just tell me how much I should pay, and I will do that, right? So that was also a case, which was an interesting thing we can discuss separately, but that not every member of the CSA actually went through that process. Some just felt it was very weird. They felt the challenge, but they sort of didn't engage with it, right? So they didn't go through that process. So they just jumped on a different way of paying, right? They said either they paid the same, kept paying the same amount they paid before, or they might have changed it, but without particular reconsideration of their assumption. So we found both types of unlearning. Yeah, the strategy, so that the more sort of discarding knowledge, the more rational, if you want, more about organization knowledge and routines. But then we found also this more, if you want, more in-depth process of pedagogical unlearning. So where it's really about challenging deeply held assumptions about, in this case, value and relations to work and care that people simply were not aware of or just took for granted, right? Before. I'll just conclude. So we have then time for a bit of Q&A. Just to summarize the key points. So I've argued that prefigurative grassroots initiatives are agents of transformative change beyond capitalism. And the question is, how do they disable capitalism? How do they deconstruct it, right? How do they undo the ideology of growth, if I use the quote from Georgios Kallis? And I propose that we need a perspective that attends to the process of unmaking of capitalism and making of post-capitalism in order to understand that, or to answer those questions. And this perspective allows us to overcome polarized readings of grassroots innovation. So either we say, oh, we are too optimistic or too pessimistic, and biases like the innovation bias that I mentioned earlier. And this perspective equips us with the analytical tools to identify concrete processes of unmaking, some of which I've briefly discussed, so unlearning, resistance, sacrifice, etc., refusal. Appreciate the dynamic of and processual work of differentiation and unmaking that underpins this transformation. Okay, so it's a continuous process, yeah. And reading prefiguration and deconstruction, so the making and the unmaking as joint processes of grassroots sustainability transformation beyond capitalism, as I've shown with the Colombian case. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. This is there are some references here. There's also the link to the project. There are more publications also already out and other upcoming. And also I acknowledge, of course, the collaboration of the 5 PhD students involved in the project and the funding. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Giuseppe. And if I can just mention, yeah, there were some striking parallels, I think, between your presentation and Arturo yesterday. Some of the theoretical underpinnings and some of the emphases, I think, really resonate here as well. yeah, we will move on to questions. We have one already here. In-person participant, and of course, everyone online, please feel welcome to submit any questions or comments.
Hi, thank you very much for your lecture. I think these were some wonderful insights. You were framing the unmaking as a practice that is emerging within those grassroots initiatives and grassroots practices. And to maybe stick with food for a second, the agro-industrial complex is, I guess, fiercely fighting these bottom-up grassroots initiatives. So I was wondering whether you also see unmaking occur through kind of directly targeting those industries, and kind of what is the role of initiatives that are not directly involved in producing food, such as, for instance, Seed in the Netherlands, or other initiatives? Like, do you see a fruitful interplay between food producing initiatives and non-food producing initiatives, I guess?
Do we collect questions or do I answer them one by one?
We can go one by one, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yes, thank you. This is, yeah, it's an excellent question. The short answer is yes, I do see the role of non-producing initiatives and movements like Seed. We are in contact here with Seed and other movements. Yeah, I mean, I've talked about, so essentially what I talked about is what we're focusing on in the project, but which is mostly this aspect of construction and deconstruction within this transformative space created by the grassroots initiatives. But yes, absolutely, that's not the only way that I see the unmaking happening. So one is, as you said, the other movements that are not necessarily producing food, but that challenge, target, and work towards resisting and deconstructing that food system. You know, you could also mention the factory farm defunding campaigns, for example, and partly, you know, also the defund campaign from, you know, fossil fuel defund campaign like Seed, and which also overlap essentially the climate, you know, climate campaigning and agri-food sustainability and sovereignty. So yeah, so there's absolutely, that's also, and there's a different set of political engagements there, right? There's the lobbying, there's the protests, there's the campaigns, etc. And I would also mention something else, which is many of the initiatives that I've mentioned and the examples I've made, they also play a double role. So on the one hand, yes, they are spaces of transformation. They create alternatives, they prefigure alternatives, and they work on this deconstruction internally. But they're also political actors themselves, right? They also participate in campaigns. They also, as an initiative or as part of the network, do their fair share of yeah, more conventional political action, sort of to challenge the system more, you know, the agri-food system more structurally, in a sense. We see that also, for example, a lot also with the CSA movement, right? And so yeah, I think I'll stop here, but I hope I answered the question.
Thanks so much. We'll take another question from the audience here, and then we'll go to a question online.
Thank you for this presentation. It was really interesting. I have more experience with grassroots initiatives that focus on housing and housing communities and eco-villages and tiny house communities. And what I see there is that these are usually very temporary based, or they have also struggling with like sustaining over a long time, not only like within like their land, like their rental structures of the land property, but also that the people living there only usually see this as a temporary base, or after a while, due to conflicts, they sort of go back to the system. So I was wondering yeah, how you see that, like more the temporary nature of certain these housing grassroots initiatives, how that then contributes to unmaking these, yeah, how that contributes to the making of these mainstream structures.
Yeah. Well, ideally, you would like them to be much more stable, right? I would say, so in agri-food, there's access to land is always a big issue, right? And then not all for example, the CSA farms own the land. Often they rent it, or they get it on a some sort of agreement, right? But not necessarily on a stable manner, right? So there is always a bit that risk. And then there's always many of these initiatives also often depend on a few leading figure, which is perhaps a bit of a contradiction, because they often, as I said, right, and as I'm sure you know, there's also this emphasis on a collective and on horizontal processes and all sorts of ways to institutionalize sort of non-hierarchical ways of decision making and organizing. But then in the end, there's some people do put more energy and more time. And when those people, for one reason or the other, are not available anymore or move somewhere else, or whatever, then there's often a moment of crisis. I don't know how to interpret that, honestly, in terms of the broader. I would say I would still value, so my first impression would be, okay, we should still value what has been built, even if at some point the initiative collapses. Because what we always see is, first of all, those who were involved will have undergone some change, and they might take change somewhere else. And second, often, you know, trying to also to challenge my own and our own way of thinking linearly. Often there are cycles and waves, or whatever metaphor you want to use, but there's something that looks like a failure at some point in time might reemerge in other forms in the future in other ways, right? And then it looks like a success suddenly, just if you take a different time frame. So I think I would still try to appreciate and value what happens in that initiative in whichever time that they've existed. If you think of this in terms of unmaking the broader system, if you want, the global structures of housing markets and the agri-food system, definitely it's a limitation. And there I think we need to not look only at grassroots initiatives. The person who intervened earlier, I think they had a point there, right? So there are other actors as well. So my thinking there would be, okay, these initiatives are part of coalitions that can be more stable. So, okay, so because there are many different actors involved, and those actors or those coalitions then can exert more political pressure and have a more stable presence in the in the political fight and in the political arena. So yeah, I think I would stop here.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from an online participant, Lydia. It's a bit long. I probably won't read the whole thing out loud, but Giuseppe, feel free to read it. But I'll just get the gist of it for our participants here. So it says, I think you mentioned that the process of deconstruction and unmaking is not competition. And how do alternative approaches and solutions, which are often grassroots, survive or even thrive in a predominant capitalist society without replacing or diminishing it? So Lydia emphasizes many local farmers are also being targeted, even murdered by violent capitalist industrial mining companies. And there's a sub-question as well later, but maybe we can address this first.
Yeah. Well, how do they survive and thrive? I think I mean, it's a reality that these initiatives exist in if you want to use Holloway's expression that has also been picked up many times, they exist in, against, and beyond, right? The system that surrounds them. And in some cases, perhaps in the Netherlands, right, it's in a context that is clearly working against these initiatives, but in most cases it's not that violent and not, not threatening to the life of the people involved in it. So there you might have more, right, perhaps the risk of co-option. So the system trying to steal some of the elements of the alternative and reselling them, repackaging them to make them fit the system, but at the same time, in a sense, depowering the alternatives, which is a problem. In other contexts, Colombia being one, but many others, there's the context is not only non-aligned, but is really also explicitly violent and really. I mean, it's. Honestly, I don't have the answer to that. Honestly, I think it's what I see. I mean, from my little, in my little experience here, is again, the more there are coalitions and sort of there's a critical mass, etc. The more, in a sense, it's also the individual initiatives can have a likelihood to survive. So you see this in many translocal networks. It's one of the functions that these translocal networks have, right? They share knowledge, but they also provide support, which can be political support, which can be visibility, which can be just the fact that they are, not 50 families, but suddenly it becomes a movement of hundreds of initiatives in the country or 1,000 initiatives in the world, etc. But the risk remains, and it's an open question in countries like Colombia. You have hundreds of activists killed every year, right? And so I think there's also a limit of thinking of movements there. So you need other, you would need other actors, the state, I guess, playing a different role. But the problem is, of course, the state there is more in collusion with violent actors in many cases. So I don't have an answer other than saying that this is, of course, a very valuable point, and especially in some regions of the world. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Yeah, there's no one recipe for unmaking, I suppose. Yeah.
No.
Well, the follow-up question was, in the second case study, so the Dutch CSAs, how do the communities determine what is fair regarding the farmer's income? Or what does fairness, how does that arise there?
Yeah, so that's the idea, is that each member can decide how much they want to pay, right? So the farmers provide certain information in terms of how many hours they work, and in one farm they also discuss the budget together, the farmers and the members who join in those workshops, so that all the members realize, what are the figures here, right? But the idea of the solidarity payment scheme in particular is that the members are free to decide how much to pay. And it's a very risky move, because they might decide to pay an amount which is not enough to repay for the labor of the farmers. So that's why there was this collective process as well. But it's not fixed by the farmers. Normally in other CSAs, it's there are different processes. Sometimes it's the farmer having more of a say, sometimes it's a more collective, but more collective process. But it is also a reality of many CSAs that farmers still don't manage to make the living income in the country. If the price of the produce was to be, you know, high enough to guarantee the a living income for the farmers, at least a living income, then the price of the food that you would get would be super high, and a lot of households wouldn't be able to afford it. Okay, so there's a really a tension there around essentially what do we value, how do we value and social inclusion and fairness for farmers. And many CSA struggle with that, and they find different solutions, but it is yeah, it is in a sense, for what I observe, a constant tension for many CSA. And yeah.
Thanks so much. So we have time for 2, maybe 3 more questions. We have 2 from the audience here. Eric, did you want to?
Hello, thank you very much for the fascinating talk. My name is Eric Swingendorf from the University of Manchester. I have 2 interrelated questions. The first one is, while I fully agree with you that the practices of subtracting from capitalism and the formation of prefigurative post-capitalist socio-ecological practices is vital, I'm not sure whether it's enough by a long way. That is what I find difficult to see, is how such social practices can translate in politicizing strategies that would contribute to a transformation of the wider capitalist socio-ecological relations. In fact, is it not the case that these prefigurative alternatives function perfectly well with the heterogeneous forms of global capitalism that we have today? It's not a threat to it. It coexists very nicely with it. In fact, it's often actively invited, nurtured, etc., to account for the heterogeneity of neoliberal capitalist cultures. So that's one question. That is, how does it contribute to a wider socio-ecological transition? Secondly, and much more worrying, I think, is the transformation of solidarity through these socio-ecological practices. And the Dutch case is a very good one to illustrate that. Here, solidarity is based on personal preferences. Do I like those farmers? How much do I pay to in solidarity, etc.? It is based on identitarian, personal embodied affect, which is radically different from what I would consider to be real important key forms of solidarity, which is double blind. That is your solidarity with the naked other, not the embodied other. If you do it with the embodied other, that means that some bodies are excluded from the solidarity. Yeah, it's only the bodies you like for a variety of reasons. This is a kind of very constrained community notion of solidarity. A double blind one is precisely what we need. And that is quite common too. The welfare state, for example, the solidarities that are built in the welfare state are double blind. You get it because you are in a particular social position, irrespective of your political preferences, consumer preferences, sexual preferences, etc. So all these new forms of solidarity that are expressed in these alternatives, not really the extreme form of neoliberal consumer choice as to who I deem to be worthy of support, versus what we really need, which is a double blind solidarity, that also those I do not like have a right to live well.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot. Just a second. So regarding the first question, I mean, I agree that's we should have put a disclaimer at some point in the presentation. I mean, I don't. I'm not a cheerleader of prefigurative initiatives. And at the same time, I'm not the one of the hyper critical or pessimist about these initiatives. So I try to situate myself in between and ask exactly that question: how do they contribute to transformation? And in that sense, I agree that what the creation of these spaces, of subtraction, autonomous spaces where alternatives can exist, etc., is not enough. My answer to that is really that this is one part of the equation, or one part of the story. I do stress what I mentioned briefly earlier, so that the fact that these initiatives are part of networks, and so essentially they engage in also in other, or they should if they don't, right? Engage in other political forms. So they engage on different political arenas. So there's the local, there's the local community, and there's that process of embedded, right, community-based transformation that involves people who otherwise would never think about, I don't know, food or energy or care or any of these issues, housing, right, in a different way. And then it engages on the broader political arena, right, the system. And again, some networks do that with some success, others don't. Others do exactly that. So they are, in a sense, I mean, simplifying a bit, but they're okay with living in their niche, right, and being on the side of or in niches within the system as it exists, and or they don't see, they're not empowered enough, or they don't see the possibility for them to really challenge us. So it's really an exit in that sense. So for me, this aspect of prefiguration is one element in that recipe, but I don't exclude it all, and I definitely consider there's the need for that other level of political engagement. But these experiences can create support, they can create arguments for that political struggle of the system, okay? Because they do create the case, in a sense, the practices that, you know, you can see them as experiments, living experiments. They're more than that, but they experiments of the future, right? And how the future might look like. So in a sense, I think there's a synergy between the two forms of political engagement, the prefigurative and the politics with the capital P. Transformational solidarity, yeah, it's a very interesting point that you raised there. Yeah, I mean, again, it's a bit of a, I guess it's the other side of the coin of these community processes, right? Because then, yes, you question solidarity, but only in relation to the people you know in that particular community. What I can say is that the reflection that came from the farmers in these cases was really connected to the sort of the inequality. So they saw themselves, in a sense, as representative of the failures of the system more broadly. Okay, so in that sense, from them, it was very clear, so that they felt, right, their own dissatisfaction and the struggle of, you know, earning a living. But that was there was a clear connection between their own experience and the sort of the flows of the system. From the member side, honestly, I would have to reflect more and look back into the also the interviews, right, the transcript, etc. But I guess you might really have a point there. It's in a sense for the members, right, that were confronted by the farmers. Clearly, it made a difference that it was the farmers they knew, right, that they were raising these issues. And if you would raise the same issues about the food system more generally, they might not feel the same, exactly because they weren't embodied. There was no connection, right, no personal connection. And yeah, so in that sense, it worked for some of the members, because not all the members were particularly engaged in that process, which is also interesting. But even the embodiment, that doesn't work for everybody. But for those members majority who went through that process, right, of reconsideration, definitely the embodiment was important. Now, the broader implications that, of course, are in your question, okay, is that they're enough, or isn't that even counterproductive, right? Well, that's yeah, it's a good point. It's a valid point. Again, my suggestion would be that it's not either or. So we can do this, right? So the fact that a community rethinks, right, solidarity, value, etc., around the farm doesn't exclude that the action is taken also at the level of the welfare system or the agri-food system, right? So I would want to play essentially, and that's a bit my my take on transformation more generally, that it's not either or. So I would like to work on different levels and on different strategies, right? And I think that there's a complementarity and the possibility to, rather than to see these things in opposition, to rather see how they might work towards to go in the same direction and help us move in the same direction. But thanks a lot for the points.
Thank you. Yeah, last question from the live audience, and then a quick one online.
Thank you. My name is Christoph Streisler from Austria. I found your presentation very interesting because it bridged this theoretical framework with the practical examples. I wanted to ask concerning the first example. From the quotations you presented, I had the impression that the farmers before had a very explicit discourse about the problems of capitalism. Is it true that this discourse is a necessary prerequisite for this, for the practice which you found in trying to transcend it?
I think just to mention, this might tie in quite well with the question online, which is
okay.
about...
Shall we take that one as well?
Sure, because Miriam says that she understood some of your framing of this unmaking processes as something new, rather than something that's been going on for generations, in some examples, for centuries, sustainable self-management and so forth. So maybe we could, do both at once.
So, I mean, of course, there's an experience like TCA is part of a much longer history of peasant struggle, right, in Colombia and more broadly. I mean, they much of what they the type of discourse and imaginary they build on connects to the food sovereignty movement and other movements in the region, right? So it's not, I mean, they re-elaborate and contribute to that, but it's also part of a shared discourse and a shared struggle in the region. But the TCA is a particular initiative. It's a particular project, political project, that has a clear, in a sense, well, again, it has a long and deep roots, but it exists and it starts to exist in a particular moment in time. And so that history, in a sense, informs, it creates, I think in the paper, we do discuss that a bit, on, how it creates certain conditions for the emergence of TCA. So there are these alliances, all these communities, for example, have already participated in strikes before, etc. Right? So there's a common underlying sort of texture that helps TCA specifically to emerge. And my point is then, yes, that helps, but then it's in a sense, TCA itself so builds on some of that resistance and that that effort, that struggle, etc. Yeah, but you could read essentially an experience like TCA. If you came only with the lens of prefiguration, you could see it as essentially a prefigurative experience, and you would miss not only that long history of struggle, but also the more specific aspects of, again, deconstruction, right? Unmaking that go on in the construction of TCA. So you could focus on those alternative institutions and how they're set up, and how, you know, how do these peasants come together, and what models they use to organize horizontally, blah blah blah, all this sort of thing, which is great, and we need it, right? So we can learn how this type of process, and TCA is really on a relatively large territory, right? So it's particularly interesting in that sense. How do you keep all these communities together, and how do you organize representative inclusion in this at such a scale? But my point is that there's the other side, and that's also important. And again, it has some more historical roots, but you know, the fight against the mining company happens now, right? And of course, it is possible also because there's a longer debate around that. But the expulsion of the company and the withdrawal from the market of some farmers happens now, and it happens with a conscious effort, right, to liberate the territory from the negative, you know, the disruption that industrial farming and mining bring to the territory, which would essentially make agroecology, which is what they envision, impossible, right? So in that sense, there's this, there's a history, but there's also something very concrete going on with sort of a, you know, going on in that construction of the specific project of TCA.
All right, thank you so much, Giuseppe.